Thank you so much for tuning in. You interested in how psychologists determine how to do no harm in a place where, in a time and a society where we have to be careful about not doing harm? If you're interested in a conversation, a deep conversation on harm, on psychologists' relationship with society, on addressing the meaning crisis, the human condition, then you're going to love this chat with highly qualified psychologist Zoe Swan. She's worked with adult and children clients suffering from PTSD, addiction, gambling. She's right into self-improvement therapy. We discussed all of those topics and more. And we actually do. You get a little bit of free therapy in here. We do a couple of really, really good, really simple exercises, which can make your life better. But look, thank you so much for tuning in. Please please share. You're going to love this conversation with Zoe. Stay with it till the end and make sure that you tell all your friends. I've really been looking forward to having a mind of your sharpness on to discuss some really interesting and, if I may say, pertinent topics.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Matt. Thanks for having me on the show. I've been looking forward to coming on.
Well, yeah. Well, you're a psychologist, highly trained, highly experienced. I'm kind of tempted to run through all of your credentials, but there are too many and that will take up too much. Okay. They will seriously take up too much time. So I'll put all them in the hyperlinks later. But I know your areas of expertise is trauma. So first, can we talk about trauma? Like, what is it and what does it do to the body and what happens? All of your
Absolutely. Yeah, good question. So trauma is when we have a negative experience that stays with us, and it can be on a continuum. So we can have a big T trauma, which is like a life-changing experience, like being in a major car accident, losing someone that we love, which is like through a terminal illness. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we can have a little T trauma that is something that stays with us, but it's not life-changing. It doesn't impact us too much. And this can be having a bad experience with a particular food, and now we can't eat that food again. Or someone saying something negative to us, and then we develop a negative core belief about ourselves. So thinking of trauma on a continuum.
Okay, so obviously what I'm hearing there is, and I'm not, when I say something, I'm not seeking validation. What I'm doing is reflecting back my understanding in the hope of correction.
Yeah, sure.
So what I'm hearing, what I'm hearing there is, it depends on the person and it depends on the context.
Absolutely.
Okay, so something that one person may find traumatic may not be so traumatic for another person, and that's not a value judgment.
No,
there's no
that's
pejorative.
So true.
There's no pejorative around that. It's just different things for different people.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting to think, how can two people go through a similar experience and one person come away traumatized and another person not? And it's really to do with the personal meaning that it might have for that person. Of course, if it involves someone that they love, or something that they've learned about themselves, it might be negative. And it could also be as well, like triggering another trauma. So if we've already had a similar trauma and then something happens that's similar, and then it reminds us of that and it brings it back up and compiles it.
So it's not so much what happens to us, it's the meaning that we associate with it. Would that be?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And that's such a good point. And when we do the therapy for trauma, and I hope I'm not jumping in too soon with talking about therapy, no thanks, but when we do the therapy for trauma, part of that is changing the personal meaning that it has for us. So what does it say about us? So we might identify an underlying core belief of, well, that trauma said that, I wasn't good enough. And we go, okay, well, what would you prefer to believe instead of I'm not good enough? And they say, well, I prefer to believe that I am good enough. And so when we're working through that trauma and we're doing the reprocessing with the MDR, which we'll talk about soon, then that changes that negative cognition to a positive cognition. And I can even sort of show you a bit about how that's done, which was really interesting.
Well, look, let's do that now. And then I've got a question
Okay.
that's burning on my mind, because I've kind of associated that
Okay.
with a broader discussion on what's happening in society, right? Because I'm a bit
Yeah.
of an internet geek, and I watch all these podcasts, and it's really, really interesting seeing these, strong atheist figures who we're getting lots of conversions to Christianity, lots. There have been some, there is, even Joe Rogan, who used to be one of the, and he's, as you know, he's the biggest media present, he's the biggest media presence on the planet, regardless of what you think about him. He used to be sneering and condescending about anyone who had any kind of like belief system. He's really starting to come around. But there's Russell Brand got baptized recently. I know, right?
Really?
Russell
Wow.
Brand is a baptized Christian. Douglas Murray,
That's amazing.
I know, right? You're getting all of these
Yeah.
other people's Ian Hurt. I never say her name right, although I've got a book here.
That's okay.
Ian Hurst. They
Yeah.
Douglas.
Sorry, I don't know her. Yeah.
Yeah. So, mate, there's some really interesting things happening now. The way Douglas Murray,
Yeah.
who was a thinker that I like and respect deeply, he's kind of like in the line of Roger Scruton. The way he discusses things, I promise you, I'm going somewhere with this, and it's relevant to
Yeah,
exactly
no, I'm interested to see. Yeah.
we're
Yeah, go for
relevant
it.
to what we're talking about. Is Douglas Murray is still an atheist. Like he was raised C of E, and kind of like went away from it. There were certain lifestyle choices he has with which are incompatible with Judeo-Christian beliefs. That's not just it though. Like for him, there are some he can't take the leap of faith. Like he absolutely adores Christianity and Judeo-Christianity. Like the way that he
Yeah.
discusses it, he loves the rituals. He attends Jewish rituals. He attends high church CV stuff.
Yeah.
But the thing is, he goes, okay, well, this is giving me meaning, and it's giving me a structure that I can, view things in. And even Richard Dawkins himself recently came out and said, okay, look, I'm culturally Christian. I understand that I accept that is the world view through which I'm viewing the lens through which I'm viewing things in. He goes, but it's still all delusion. But if it's a delusion, like if it's what they're basically saying to themselves, I think, and to the public is, okay, look, this is all, it's all still Codswallop. It's a lie, but it's a comforting lie, and you should believe it because that's what gets you through the night. That's not just as an individual, but that's what coheres us as a society, because you really can't have a society without having some sort of narrative, some sort of meaning, some sort of shared fundamental belief. You can't have a society. So
Yeah.
I'm sure by now you've picked up what I'm kind of saying. Are we deluding ourselves? Like, are you deluding yourself when you do these kind of things? Is it a positive delusion? And is that kind of what we need to do? Like, how do you link that with reality? And I suppose, so look, I'll just let you talk, and then I can give you some structure around to discuss it. Like, so if someone really has done something terrible, like you wouldn't tell them, oh no, that's not terrible. Like you go, you can't, you see what I mean? Like you can't delude, you can't lie.
Yeah, that's interesting, and just on that, you saying that, and maybe it, I don't know if it's a bit off topic, but I was reading a book, I can't remember what it was, but it said, we have no direct contact with reality, which is really interesting to think. We have no direct contact with reality. And so we all have our own reality that we're sort of living through, in that collective reality. And but maybe if we talk about also just going back to talking about trauma. And so what trauma does is it blocks our neural processing. So we say that because although chronologically that trauma might have happened some time ago, biologically and psychologically, that trauma is happening for us now, because unable to think or feel greater than that trauma. So it's interesting, isn't it, talking about reality and how trauma can impact our experience of reality. And yeah, so yeah, it's interesting to reflect on.
You know, 100%. And no, I mean, you're right, because ultimately, this got deep quickly. So you know, well, you're kind of right, and it's linked with
Yeah.
with the book that you have. So you know, when we say what is reality, I mean, that implies that there is an reality external to human beings that we can kind of like access. And I think that's true, but I don't think that it's true in the materialist forensic sense. Like, you know, being a former, look, I'll make a couple of comments so you can kind of like understand where I'm coming from. So
yeah, definitely. Yeah.
I think you're right. We can't access reality directly. It's just too complicated. And I mean both material reality and I mean, you know, the ultimate reality of, I mean, you're Jewish, I'm a Christian, so it's like God.
Yeah.
And I know that I know you well enough to say that we're both talking fundamentally. There are some distinctions, but we're talking about the same God. Okay, you and I have the same.
Yeah, I know. Oh, absolutely, we do, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So we can't. So in the material sense, I'll start off with that. Because the world is literally too complicated for us to perceive and process, we work through symbols. Like, you know, like there are all these heuristics that we kind of like use. That's when we talk about unconscious bias. It's like you might see someone and you stick them in a category. So there's, although it's kind of easy to overcome, there's a degree of kind of like truth with that. It doesn't mean you have to. It's like, you know, your first instinct is stuff like that. But we also see it in writing, like, you know, is there such a thing as 5? Does 5 actually exist? You know, show me 5. You can't show me 5, but we've got this symbol. And if you don't negotiate the world with an understanding that 5 really exists, you're a bit of a crazy person.
Yeah.
But does 5 really exist? So you know, this book is totally right. We need an arbiter between both material and spiritual reality, because it's just simply too complicated. And too.
And I guess and you've raised a good point there about, you know, how do we navigate ourselves through, you know, our reality, and one of the ways is by our values. And I think, you know, bringing into it that talk about, you know, religion and that sort of thing. So, but everyone, you know, has values, and so that's our guide. That's like what steers us through. So what are our values? What's important to us? And then also what are our morals? And then how do those two connect?
So if you're doing some specific, so someone has come to you with a problem, and like I used to be a peer support officer when I was in the police. So you get people sneaking up to you and they'd want to discuss stuff. It's like, hey, Matt, you know, this happened. And sometimes, like without going into specifics, what they'd done was wrong. And sometimes they'd actually, because people find out about themselves, like we've all got a self-image, but then you actually get tested and you find out it's like, oh, wow, I've just completely shattered my self-image. I thought I was Luke Skywalker, but I'm actually Darth Vader. Like I thought I'd be this, you know, I thought I'd be this cool soup. I thought I'd be brave. I thought I'd be true. I thought I'd be, actually, I'm a kind of cowardly piece of shit. Like, how do you, so when you are speaking to someone like that, like you want them to get through the trauma, you want them to process it, you want to give them the right meaning. But you also need it linked with reality. So you can't put them in this delusional world that we were talking about a second ago. So, no, it's okay. It's okay to kill babies. No. I mean, like, no. Like, okay. So, I mean, how do you kind of like, I don't know that's extreme and that's hyperbole, but like, can you walk me through, like, you know, what do you do? I mean, it's a tough job what you do.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So it's interesting that you say that, you know, so we're talking about, you know, when we've got the trauma, it's blocking our neural pathways. So it changes the way that we think. It's blocking our neural processing. And how we know that we have trauma is that different things in our environment might trigger us. So they might make us feel anxious, or we might notice that we have the unconscious bias, but it might be like a conscious bias towards a particular thing that we can identify where that came from. And as we're working through the trauma, so what happens is the trauma is actually that memory actually sits in the hippocampus, which is close to the amygdala.
Yep.
And so the amygdala is the part of the brain that regulates emotion. And that's what gives the memory its emotional charge. And then we've got the long-term memory, which is where during REM sleep, all of our memories, you know, they get picked up at nighttime, and they get transferred from the hippocampus into our long-term memory. And when that happens, two things occur. One, we're able to, everything's put into perspective. So it's integrated with all of the other information that we have. So we're able to see and experience it from a different perspective. And secondly, it's no longer in the part of the brain that regulates emotion. So it loses its emotional charge. So when we work through trauma, changing our reality, I'm not sure if that would be 100% the way I would quantify that, but it certainly changes our experience of the way that we experience the world, because we're not triggered anymore, and we're able to take a step back and I guess sort of recognize what we've learned from that trauma, now that it's no longer affecting us.
Oh, well, see, that kind of brings us back, and that makes total sense about what you were talking about before. Now, that really puts things in perspective. So, you know, an event is not in and of itself traumatic. It's kind of like what happens to it. And that's why we can have such a thing as post-traumatic stress growth, because we all know what post-traumatic stress disorder is. Can you kind of like discuss if there's such a thing as post-traumatic stress growth? Can trauma be a good thing and part of an important part of personal development, including the suffering that goes with it? So I don't just mean like you went through something traumatic and you're a hero, you demonstrated that and you pat yourself on the back. I mean, you went through something terrible, you stuffed it up, you acted in a way that was contrary to your beliefs. Can you come through that and become a better person?
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that topic of post-traumatic growth. And so, and also looking at how is post-traumatic growth different from resilience. And so resilience is when we go through an experience and it makes us stronger, and we think, well, next time we would have done things differently. And so resilience is being able to manage the trauma or the bad experience that we went through, and come out the other side and say, now I'm a stronger, more capable person. And post-traumatic growth is something extended on from that, in that the traumatic experience changes our philosophy of life, changes the way we look at the world, changes our identity. And I want to talk about someone, but I can't remember her last name, but she's an amazing woman, the woman who does all of the triathlons. Her name is Sarah. I can't remember her last name, but she's amazing.
I'll look that up. Keep talking.
Look it up, yeah. Because I'll use her as an example. Sarah Crowley. Yeah, is that it? Yeah. She's amazing. So that's a really good example of post-traumatic growth. So she lost, one of her legs was amputated when she was, I think, 4 years old, due to a congenital something that she was born with. And then she went on to run triathlons. She does Ironman. Nike have just released their first shoe for a prosthetic foot, and they called it the Sarah. So that's an example of you know, someone going through something really traumatic and actually using that to as a catalyst to change their identity. Another really good example of post-traumatic growth is he's my favorite, Viktor Frankl, who developed logotherapy.
Yeah, love him.
Frankl.
Yeah, love him.
Yeah, and his philosophy is that finding meaning and purpose in that suffering. What meaning did that suffering have for you, and then moving beyond that.
So, I mean, what I'm picking up there is it's sometimes you need to be broken down to be built back up. So,
yeah, that's a good,
you know, and so sometimes, I mean, but if you think what that means for our relationship with suffering, Because like as a society, we have a
True.
very Buddhist attitude towards suffering. And by that I mean is like suffering is a bad thing to be avoided. Whereas kind of
Mm.
like, my personal view is like, okay, don't get me wrong, don't go running towards suffering because like it's gonna find you. But like
Yeah.
when suffering comes up and smacks you in the face, embrace it. It's
Mm.
probably got a lesson to teach you.
Yeah.
And I mean
Absolutely.
embrace it. You
Yeah.
know, I
I
mean that.
agree.
Like, you know what I mean?
Mm.
So you're a Viktor Frankl fan too. I mean, God, how can you not be?
Yeah, I am. I love Viktor Frankl, and I'm 100% with you on the suffering, because I hear something. Sometimes people say things like, why does God allow suffering in the world, and that sort of thing. And I really, if you look at it, there's no growth without pain or without challenge. And so what we want to ideally is to experience that suffering within our window of tolerance. And so if we're within our window of tolerance for that suffering, then we're able to grow from that experience. But if it's outside of that window of tolerance, then that suffering can sometimes break us. And that's when we get, really complex cases of post-traumatic stress and that sort of thing. Yeah.
Can people come back from that really terrible post-traumatic stress? Like, well, I mean, I suppose the answer is yes, because Frankl did. Like, what's worse?
Yeah.
For the listeners that don't know, Viktor Frankl was a chap who went through the death camps. Like
Mm.
what's worse than Auschwitz? Really? Nothing.
Yeah, for sure.
Like, it's kind of, So, I mean, can
Cool.
you can you kind of discuss that from a professional?
Yeah, absolutely. It's totally doable to work through things like post-traumatic stress and complex PTSD, and any sort of trauma. There's some really great therapies developed. I know psychedelic assisted therapy has just been approved. So there's
Oh, Timothy
people
Leary.
waiting to get
Woohoo!
that. Yeah, it's really interesting. It's very exciting that it's that we're coming up with these, exploring these new ways to be able to help people to release that trauma. But another one is EMDR. So EMDR has been around since the mid-1970s, developed by Dr. Francine Shapiro, and she was a psychologist in America, and she had been through a traumatic experience herself. And she discovered this eye movement that replicates what we do in REM sleep, that helps to reprocess traumatic memories. And it's very interesting because that was developed about the time of the Vietnam War in America. And so there were a lot of soldiers who were returning with PTSD. And so the initial clinical trials were run through the American Defense Force, because that was considered at that time to be a miracle treatment for PTSD, and it still is a very effective treatment.
Well, can you run us through, like, would this be an appropriate time to run us through some of the treatments and give us an example
Yeah.
of something like that? I mean, is this an appropriate time?
Yeah.
Like, you want to go through
No,
with us?
absolutely.
Yeah,
No,
okay.
definitely. It's very, I say it's a simple and easy method, but it's emotionally difficult, because we're revisiting that trauma, and the eye movements are actually releasing the trauma in the body. They're reprocessing the trauma in the brain, so that person is experiencing quite often similar emotions to what they did. They're like on a similar level, not necessarily the same, the same level of disturbance, normally less than that, but working through it like that. So all that, so first of all, get the EMDR, we get it set up. There's a preparation process that goes with it, and it's coupled with other therapies as well. So it's unusual that it's used just on its own. We'll normally use some, cognitive behavioral therapy with it, or some psychotherapy, but it involves that person finding the target memory for the trauma and giving that memory a name. And then we determine what's the underlying core belief. I don't need to give you an example, because I use an
Please.
example of someone who's afraid of elevators. So let's say that there's a lady called Jill, and Jill is afraid of elevators. and she comes to therapy to overcome this fear. We want to find a target memory for her. And the one she chooses is when she went to visit a friend at a hotel. She gets to the hotel and she realizes that her friend is staying on the 10th floor. So she calls that memory Bella Vista, because that's the name of the building. We say to Jill, when you think of that memory, how disturbing is that for you now when you think of it? Now, this is important because if we can't bring up any emotion when we think of the memory, we can't work through it. There needs to be some level of negative emotion. So Jill says, at the time that it was happening, it was a 10, but now when I think of it, it's like a 6. So it's still high, pretty high. We want to find out the underlying core belief. So we say, Jill, why are you afraid when you get in the elevator? And she says, well, it's because I feel unsafe. And we say, okay, that's your underlying cognition. And we say to her, well, what would you prefer to believe when you get in the elevator? She says, well, I prefer to believe that I'm safe. Okay, now this is interesting. So cognitively, Jill knows that she's safe when she gets in the elevator. Yeah. Otherwise, she wouldn't be getting in there.
Yeah.
But we want to find out how true that feels for her. And so she says, do you know what? It just doesn't feel true at all. It's like a 2. Okay. So we reactivate the memory just by getting her to run through it in her mind like a movie. And then the therapist would take her through the eye movements. Now, as Jill is doing those eye movements, her subjective unit of distress is automatically going down, which makes the negative cognition of I am unsafe less believable, and the positive cognition of I am safe more believable. So uninstalling that negative cognition and installing the positive cognition helps with the reprocessing.
Wow. All right. Would it be appropriate to actually lead us through? Like, is there something, or is that or any other exercise that you could lead us through? Like,
maybe not so much the EMDR is something that we do in therapy.
Okay.
What did you have in mind?
Oh, well, I'm sorry. I don't know. It just sounded kind of like cool. And I think, well, if there's any techniques or anything like that you could give to the audience, to kind of like,
Yeah, for like self-soothing, like that sort of thing.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you for asking. So if you do find that, if a trauma comes up and, are you getting that anxiety feeling, then there's a self-soothing technique called butterfly tapping. And this is an EMDR technique that uses bilateral stimulation to move that anxious energy through your body. And so the way that you do it is you just cross your arms. And would you like to do it together? I'll do it together. So you cross your arms like that. That's perfect. And we're just tapping like this. We just start off tapping, alternate tapping, side to side. That's perfect. Right arm, then the left, and so forth. Now, some people like to do the tapping fast. Some people like to do it slow. It's whatever works for you. Sometimes we start off fast, and then as we calm down, we get slower. And we do a couple of sets. So however the sets, long you want to make the sets last for, that's up to you. But if you want to guide, it's 30. So counting 1, 2, count to 30. And then we take a break and we take a deep breath. And we let it go. And then we go again. If we tap at 60 beats per minute, our heart rate will sync to that 60 beats. So that's a good tip. And yeah, and even if you tap like your foot or you're tapping the desk, your heart rate will start to sync to that. And you can do this, but you can also do them on your thighs as well, like alternate tapping on your thighs. And so a lot of people will do this when they're at work, like under their desk, or you can do it when you're out and about. So it's a sort of good, like, secret way of self-soothing.
Well,
Yeah.
that's a free therapy session along with that. I mean, you know,
Yeah.
you got it here on Northern Vibe, listeners. You got it here.
Mm.
So continuing on this, because
Welcome.
I'm really kind of like I'm really kind of interested in it. Like when you think of like all the things that's going on in society today. So why don't we get like
Yeah.
I knew quite a few people from the Second World War. I knew a lady
Yeah, right.
who lived in London. She was through the Blitz, and like she got bombed, and like her house got blown up. And these incredible stories.
Yeah,
that
wow.
magnificent Cockney woman told me. But like,
Yeah, right.
how is it that we had this entire generation go through that much trauma, and yet we didn't get like the mass psychosis, you know, societal psychosis that we got? We didn't get like all these suicides.
Yeah.
We didn't get all these, you know, we didn't get all this. We didn't get all this, you know, indicative of trauma. We didn't get like, why? Like, I mean, were they
That is
just
such an
tougher than
interesting
us?
question.
Like, you know, I mean, what's going on there? Because like, I mean, if
Yeah.
that happened now, look at all these people going, oh my God, there's going to be, you know, and there probably would be, like, you know, there'd be all these weird things that are sweeping, you know, weird things that sweep through society. You know, you expect higher DV, you'd expect higher murder rates, you expect, you know, you expect all these, you'd expect higher homelessness, you'd expect higher breakups, you'd expect all these kind of things.
Yeah.
But that kind of like really didn't hit until the 60s. Like it was, you know, they're kids that like went a bit weird. I don't know, maybe, I don't know. That's
Yeah.
But like, you know,
Yeah.
how come you didn't get that World War II generation who went through a traumatic event? Like, you know, what was it about them?
Yeah.
What was going on there?
Yeah. That's interesting. That is it's such an interesting question. I think there's a lot of aspects to that. So one of them is, and I know just something that you talked about was you said that why the suicide rate's so high now. And I think that one of the reasons is because we're recording the suicide rates, whereas before suicide was something that might have been kept hidden. There were certain consequences to suiciding if you were in a particular religion. I remember watching that movie Virgin Suicides. Remember that movie from the 90s? No, it was a famous movie. It's more of a girly movie. That's why you haven't seen it. But the girl in there, she's young and she kills herself, and the priest comes up to the parents and he says, or the coroner or the priest, and he says, might be the coroner, and he says, I want you to know that I'm writing that up as an accident. So I think that a lot of things might have been a sort of
Look,
I don't know, but I don't know.
I think
one of the reasons.
I think there is that possibility, but
yeah.
And yeah, you know, it probably did distort it, but like the absolute numbers that we're talking about now, it's just you can't account for recording stats. I think the recording and categorization would have had some effect, but I just don't think that can account for the complete thing. I think that there's a crisis of meaning in our society today, and I think it's linked to a lot of things, but I think the fundamental cause is our move away from a uniting religious belief, because we were formerly a Judeo-Christian society, and I think us as a community moving away from that is what's sorry, it's my girl making noise on purpose. I think yeah, God love her. But yeah, I think us moving away from that is what's causing a lot of this. And I think that's reflected too, because if you look in our conceptualization of categories, because one of the things Judeo-Christianity did for us was give us categories. You know, a breakdown of categories. It's like, well, you know, God created man and women, and God had all these animals, and so you know, you see this categorization and naming of things. So you know, G.K. Chesterton, who's a very famous Catholic philosopher, said once people stop believing in God, it's not that they believe in nothing; they'll believe absolutely anything. And you know, we're having serious discussions now about what a woman is. It's like, well, they're not. So I think that's kind of linked. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So just actually, as you're talking about that suicide, you're saying, no, I think that there's a different, you know, and I agree. I reflecting on that, there's a lot, and one of them is that if we know someone who's suicided, we're people are a lot more likely to do it themselves, because they're that's sort of they sort of feel a bit more comfortable with the idea. Sometimes it can go completely the opposite way. Sometimes people are like, no, I'd never ever do that. But there's certainly a relationship between someone having suicided close to someone else, and then them feeling more comfortable doing, them seeing that as a way sort of to end things. And I think also particularly definitely with children, the rise of social media, which doesn't have any being bullied online, and sort of that I think more access to that sort of stuff as well. Yeah. So maybe that's one of them. Yeah. But you're also talking before about, why do people go through that, post World War II, how do they go through that and not be traumatized? And depending on the individual person, one of the reasons for that is that now there's less stigma around trauma. There's more education around trauma. So previously we might have said, oh, that person is just, angry, or that person, hits their kids. And now we can say, well, that person does that because of trauma that happened to them in their life. And so they'll be a lot more likely to recognize. So maybe it's a way that we sort of categorize it as well.
So fundamentally what I'm hearing there is it's a reporting issue. Again, like it's a recording and reporting issue. I'm not kidding, I'm not convinced by that. I'm just not convinced by it.
No, okay, yeah.
No,
yeah,
but
right,
I mean, look,
yeah.
I think it impacts too. And the thing with social media is though too, I mean, oh my God, especially as a parent, oh my God, I really want to blame social media. You know what I mean? It's like, oh, well, if we just, in that Canadian advertising psychologist who said, the medium is the message. There's such a degree of, of truth to that. But it kind of like gives us an out. It means that we can treat the symptoms rather than the fundamental issue. And I'm convinced in society today there is a deep crisis of meaning. Like, why if it's true that we're all just if the materialist worldview, and I won't say atheist, but like if the materialist worldview that there is nothing else is true, the question is not why live your life. The question is like, sorry, the question is not why wouldn't you live your life. The question becomes why would you live? Like, suffering has no point. There is no end. There is no like, oh, so you were happy for 10 minutes. Well done, delusional you. I think these things come back to really deep, and I mean really, really like deep kind of like stuff going on there. Because if you remove meaning and point from people's lives, like they become nihilistic. Like it's actually rational. So if you were doing your therapy, it's like, okay, so you're moving through this, man. Then let's appeal to your rationality and the evidence here. There is nothing. This is only just like you're deluding yourself. Can you kind of see it actually links back to like, what we're kind of like talking about?
I can see where you're going. And like, as you're talking, it's something brought something else as well, is that it's the expectation, in terms of being satisfied with life, and it's the and whether or not that particular thing causes a trauma. It can also be the expectation that we have, because if we were expecting that to happen, we're going to accept it. We're not going to be as traumatized by it. Whereas in today's society, we do have a very high standard of living, and most suicides are really linked to stress. So it's when our capacity to cope, because of the stress is it exceeds our capacity to cope. And so perhaps we in some ways do have a lot more stress than we had back then. It's certainly a lot easier now, but a lot more stress in terms of maybe financial stress, people able to get, and the expectation that this is a type of lifestyle, and so having to keep up with that maybe in itself is stressful.
Yeah, no, that's well, I find that compelling. I think that's a kind of like compelling argument, actually. Yeah. All right, look, can we get into there's really something that's being discussed a lot on some of the circles that I go into, and it's this concept of iatrogenesis. And what that is, it's the idea that the causation of a disease or harmful complication is caused by medical activity and intervention itself. Now, this is especially discussed around, well, it's becoming more and more, like it started off in the kind of like COVID realm, but now with this explosion of mental illness and how it's categorized and how we treat it, like there's some discussion as to whether or not that's happening, like within, and like, obviously your profession, and within that kind of, within that kind of stuff. So like,
that's
I suppose, I think it would be, for complete clarity, like I'm pro science and all that kind of stuff. I think it would be incorrect and unfair to blame the recent meteoric rise in mental illness on psychology. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
I don't think that, but I do think that perhaps the over therapization, and that's an adjective I just invented right now, of people may have some sort of impact. Because like, it's like this, oh, well,
that's a good question.
yeah. So, I mean, how did it look? So I suppose direct questions around that would be something like, what framework do you have to know when it's like, okay, well, this person's had enough therapy, or in fact, they don't really need therapy, or, how do you recognize, treatment dependency? And is there, like looking at the profession itself, is there really an incentivization to pathologize and treat things that maybe are just part of the human condition?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I remember years ago going to a conference, it was a gambling conference actually, by I think the National Australian Gambling Studies, and Alex Belinsky, who was the president of that at that time, gave a presentation on, are we over pathologizing, everyday things? So sometimes people will think, well, so for example, anxiety is normal to some degree. If we don't have, if we're not anxious about certain things, if we don't have fear, that's what's keeping us alive. It's a protective factor. So that's why we're feeling anxious. So the way that we, and certainly maybe we can even look at the DSM sometimes, the Diagnostic Statistic Manual, and sort of say, well, is this, are these things like normal? Because there's a lot of other, disorders creeping up and put in there. So the main thing is how much of an impact is it having on that person's life? Okay. So, for example, it might be a lot of people have a fear of public speaking, let's say, for example. Okay. And so that's okay, that's normal, that's natural. And it's not necessarily it's not a disorder, and certainly even if they come to therapy, that's not a disorder. But if it's impacting their ability to do their job or to fulfill their life dream, that's when we'd say, okay, well, now this is something that we need to look at. So it's how much of an impact is this having on your life? Yeah. Okay, so that's not, no, see,
I think that's a great structure, because that, that is a way that you can, that's a really important framework. It's like, so there's a degree of subjectivity there and self-reporting, but you're kind of like putting it, you're still comparing it to a bell curve. It's like, okay, well, you're not going to die because you're not good at public speaking. Like it's not something that we need to like sit you down, but you're at point A, and we want to get you, and you want to get to point B, and we can help you get there. Yeah. Is that correct?
Yes.
And fundamentally, that's
absolutely. Yeah, that's what it's about. Yeah.
And that would be the same, even if someone was like, okay, so you talked about anxiety or something, or depression or something before. Again, all of these things are just part of the human condition. You know what I mean?
That's right. Yeah.
It's like, okay, do you ever get to the point though, like where if someone kind of comes in and they're reporting something, and like, obviously, you're going to listen, you're going to, do all that kind of stuff, and you go, you know what, this is just something that's normal, and you can work through it, and maybe give them a couple of techniques like the tapping technique and stuff that we did before, which is like, I'm not mocking that. You know what I mean? It's like, You know,
No,
this is,
no, this is a very good point. Yeah, yeah.
you know,
And I think that what you're saying, yeah, go on. Sorry.
yeah, because like I think it'd be hard to do that because especially like if, you know, if your practice is like, you know, that's how you make money. Like, you know what I mean?
Mm,
So sometimes it's going to be
yeah.
hard for any individual to be able to make the distinction, even a highly trained professional to, you know, to not mix self-interest with something like that. And like I found that hard.
Well, you know, it's
You know,
yeah, it's interesting that you say that because a lot of therapy, or one of the things that we do in therapy, not a lot of it, one of the things we do is normalizing that person's experience of the trauma, and that can be really reassuring as well. People will say, "Oh, I thought I was going crazy," or "I thought this was really abnormal," and even just saying to them, you know, anyone who had been through that experience would be feeling anxious, would be feeling sad, and even that in itself is healing.
100%.
Yeah,
And look,
yeah.
I found that too, like when I was in the police, like if you, because initially when I joined, like I was really young, and so when we turned
Yeah.
into suicide, we would always dance around the concept of suicide. You know, we kind of like, you know, we wouldn't talk about that much.
Yeah,
But
right.
once I learned and we were kind of trained, it's like, no, like if you're there and you suspect someone is having suicidal thoughts, ask them like directly. And
Yeah, right. Yeah,
that's so counterintuitive, you know what I mean?
that's amazing. Yeah.
And I kind of like found that it's like seeing you be sitting there with someone, and one of the things I learned to do was listen. So, you know, hand on my
Yeah.
genitard here. You know, like
Yeah.
seriously listen to that person. And you were going through and it's like,
Mm.
oh, okay, so that happened to you. Oh, I'd feel that way too. You know, you show that empathy and you just be telling the
Yeah.
truth.
Yeah.
Okay,
Mm.
are you feeling suicidal? And so many
Yeah.
times the people, yes, I've had these thoughts, and like they just want to talk about it. You know, they
Yeah.
want to tell someone. But I'd also notice then they'd be watching for your response like a hawk. Like, and I know this is what you
Yeah.
do every day, but like a hawk. So like obviously if we're going there as an emergency service, like they haven't turned up at like at a clinic going, hey, I'm not feeling too well. It's kind of like there's a rope,
Mm.
literally a rope around their neck. Literally they've got this,
Yeah.
you know, literally they're on the edge,
Yeah.
like
Right. Yeah.
literally.
Of course. Yeah.
You're kind of talking to those like cross situations, and it's like you'd be sitting there talking to people, and sometimes they just want to talk about that, and they'd be watching for your response and go, and you know, I'd always say something along the lines of like, well, I understand how you came to that conclusion. Like, you know, I'd never just like,
Mm.
wow, like I understand that
Yeah.
you feel that
Yeah.
way, and
How much pain you're in.
let's
Yeah.
let's talk about that. And you know, but you know, you wouldn't even jump straight into the that's wrong, or you know, you don't label it. You know, you just you
Yeah. That's it. That's
don't do
invalidating.
that.
Yeah. Yeah.
You don't do that, and you don't do. Oh my God, you don't act all shocked. It's like, oh, okay. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? So that
Yeah.
is, yeah, I get that. You know, you kind of like you're working through that. How real though,
Yeah.
like, to ask a
Yeah.
direct question about the you know, about the iatrogenesis. How real do you think
Genesis.
that is? Like, is that actually a real problem, do you think, or is it more of a not conspiracy theory, but is it more of a blowing up concern? Do you think?
That's a good question um because what we do in therapy, like the experience for the client is subjective. So quite often and it's client driven as well. So you're asking clients what they want to work on. I mean, even if the client comes to therapy, some clients come to therapy and they're having like 10 beers a night, you know, you say, is that something you want to work on? They say no. Okay. Maybe it might be contributing to depression, you know, we'll maybe like, you know, gently like touch on that later on, but it's client driven. So so iatrogenesis, yeah, maybe some people might be sort of prone to that. Certainly something that we have to be careful of as therapists is not to tell the client you know like how they should feel, or to tell them, look, I think that maybe you know, this is wrong with you, and start going on a kind of a like an exploration sort of mission or something like that, which I don't think is something that I think there's something that anyone really does, because there's so usually people have come in and they've got the presenting issue that they're working with. Another thing as well is that a lot of people don't want to come to a therapy, or something I hear you know, sometimes from people who don't want to come, is that they're worried about being diagnosed with a mental illness. And so, you know, if they're worried about getting that mark on their name that I've been diagnosed with a mental illness, that there's and so we don't really use you know, don't really use like we might use like diagnostic terms, you know, like anxiety or PTSD, but actually saying, like, labeling someone and saying like, okay, now you've been diagnosed with, you know, that it's not really the context that we work around, more working with the presenting symptoms. And so that's what we're concerned with, rather than trying to put a label, although having a label is, having a framework is helpful because it gives us the treatment method that we're going to work through. But yeah, focusing more on the symptoms than the label of the illness.
100%. But
does that answer your question?
It does. But there's kind of like follow-up question to it, because I understand it's just a diagnostic tool and everything you said. But like a lot of people, obviously, they're going to think this is to a certain extent definitive. And I think this links into what I
that's the point.
because like I saw like my eldest daughter, who's left home, absolutely brilliant young lady, fantastic. She's just going to kick ass. For a little while there, she had a group of friends who were like, you know, I was kind of concerned about. And like I you know, I wasn't eavesdropping, but they'd be sitting around the table or whatever it is, like, oh, I've got this, and they'd be like swapping diagnosis. And my daughter didn't and hasn't got one. And I could tell, like, firstly, I was sitting there going, what the fuck? Like, and secondly, she kind of, and I could tell from her body language, she wanted to, like, and because women especially, you know, with the bonding thing, they bond around pain and suffering, right? That's what women do. You know, it's this empathy. It's like, oh, I've got empathy with that.
It's the empathy,
So she thought, she was starting to think, and I actually had to sit her down and have a conversation with her. She was starting to think there was something wrong with her because there was nothing wrong with her. And because, no, like, I mean that. Like, it's funny, but I mean that. And I think that it's like, you know, well, what diagnosis are in you? Like, where are you? And these things are on a spectrum. Like, I get that. But especially when you're young, and especially, well, even if you're older and you're just not scientifically trained, you don't understand that. No, it's not a category. It's a tool for diagnosis. The two are not one and the same.
But, and that's a really good point, you know, because so that sounds like that's about identity, you know, and that's become part of that person's identity, and that's how they differentiate themselves as being special. In a way as well, you know, I've got this, I've got that, I've got, you know, and it sounds like that's self-diagnosed. I don't know those, I don't know, but sounds like it might be as well, but it's definitely part of you know, maybe identity. And
Well, you know, there's a really obvious topic there that's kind of like, I don't know how far we can walk into. It's like, so if you think that you're, you know what I mean?
But even when you said that, you know, the first thing that came to my mind was anorexia. You know, because anorexia is so difficult to treat because it's so closely tied in with that person's identity. And so we've got to, and so, you know, that's about, building an identity, finding a new identity, and moving towards that healing. But yeah, you're right. It is, and maybe going back to that initial, you know, you were talking about that identity sort of crisis, like we begin with something like that, reality crisis or meaning. But yeah, so maybe sort of that might tie in a little bit, but certainly things that maybe you know, things about us that make us feel special, and sometimes that can be you know, one of them as well, sort of a way to differentiate ourselves in a world where we feel that one of many.
Obviously, you know, the glaring example of trans goes into that, but like you know, I'd rather avoid that, not so much because I've got in trouble with it before, because like I've had some magnificent conversations with trans people and stuff on Northern Vibe. So if this is your first time watching this, I've spoken to a detransition person, an FTM trans person who, and I've also facilitated a conversation between a trans person and Sal Grover, who's the lady going through High Court right now for not letting a trans person into an all-female space. It's going to be, incidentally, it's going to be the Marbo of the human rights case in Australia. Seriously,
it will be interesting.
The world's watching that, and that conversation that I facilitated was was magnificent. But you are right. You have all these contain. So I've kind of covered off on that, and I don't think I need to dig too deep in that there. But like,
Yeah.
I'm going to go out on a limb, and I was thinking about this today while I was gardening, and it's kind of like it terrified me because I was going through it, and I was thinking about some other, with all this assisted suicide and stuff that's going on, like abortion was sold to us as like, it's going to be safe, legal, and rare. No, it's not. Like, it's the biggest cause of like, yeah, okay.
We have abortion in Judaism, so it's legal in Judaism. Yeah.
Yeah, but like, I mean,
obviously
us Christians, we kind of like it's a big no for us. And it's like, and it's the greatest cause of death of kids. So this idea that it's going to be safe, the point being is like, it was sold as safe, legal, and rare.
It was sold as what it was. Yeah, what you're saying,
bullshit. Like, what a lie.
Yeah.
Now, if you're looking at the assisted suicide, which is happening, right? And like in Canada, like it was first introduced in Holland years ago, and just like all these people that were just depressed. And of course, the lie was, no, we're not just going to execute people who are depressed. No. That's exactly what happened. That's exactly what happened, because you had the mission creep. All the lies were told in Parliament. All the lies were told on TV. Oh, it's dignified. It's happening in Canada now too. Again, it's just beginning this massive, massive, massive spike. Where I'm going with this is this: the next contagion for our teenagers, especially our girls, is going to be suicide. We've been through bulimia. We've been through all these other things. We've been through, we're going through the trans thing, which is like more girls do it. The next big thing, Zoe, and God, let me be wrong. Please let me be wrong. But the next social contagion that's going to sweep through the West is young women killing themselves. Medically and legally. Mark my word.
Are you ready? Yeah, right. Okay, well, that's an
Mark
interesting
my words.
space.
The pattern's been established. The pattern is, this is not Matt Maloney like looking into a crystal ball. It's like, let's look at these patterns of human behavior in the past. You've had bulimia, you've had these things, and each one of them, incidentally, is kind of getting worse. Okay, first you start off bad, next you're chopping off your genitals, next you're doing, what's the next thing? You die.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, because we got, and I think that we've sort of been preempted, through things like the Resilience Project. That's huge. It's in all the schools now, and so teaching children, using it as an opportunity to sort of preempt that and teach kids resilience. And I don't know, what do you think? Do you think that I kind of feel like we've got this trend, but at the same time it's been preempted, and we're doing things to keep up, to like combat that, to turn it around. Yeah.
Well, it's really hard. So like, if you link it back to the conversation we're having a second ago, so we kind of like, in my experience and from my understanding, and like, I'm not trained. When I say I've read the literature, I haven't read the literature. What I've done is I've read a couple of like executive summaries of like, the stuff that I needed to know when I was out on the street. Okay. So I'm not going to misrepresent, but like, from my understanding of doing the reading, and I did as much as I could, and it wasn't nothing incidentally, is that like, so when you're talking to someone who's already suicidal, they're already at that spot, it's a good thing. But there was this old idea before that we kind of talked about. It's like, well, are you putting the idea into someone's head? Now, I don't know how true that is. I've never read any literature on that. But this comes back to the this idea is like, are we making things worse? Like, if you're going to do mass training, and the whole thing is, look, if you're going into schools, you're not dealing with individuals, right? Straight away, you're dealing with a collective. So straight away, you can't tailor something to that specific person and need. You need to talk about generalities.
Yeah.
You need to talk about all these kind of stuff. I think there is a real danger, a la the kind of like discussion that I was talking about before with my daughter, where it's like, maybe you are introducing and normalizing in a negative way the concept. You see what I'm picking up? Like, sometimes you need to articulate and name things to deal with them. You need to diagnose something. That's what a diagnosis is, right? But sometimes,
true.
Sometimes when you name something, you call it out.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
That's the dual purpose of naming things. So, you've got to be careful about naming things. Like, in our, I'll say our shared religious history, like naming a demon calls them forth. I know that's true in
I'm not
Judaism.
sure.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Yeah.
I've had discussions with the rabbi over
Yeah.
it. So it's like, yeah, be
Yeah.
careful about calling these things forth. Yet naming things is really powerful. You see that in the Old Testament. It's like the first thing that Adam did when he was kind of like, even before he was conscious, even before Eve called him into consciousness, was to name. That is to recognize categories, to name things.
Yeah.
So you've got this, naming something is, and we take it for granted, but names are, and this is one thing that the Murray people, because I've worked a lot in the Cape York, they have 100% right. It's like, you want to be careful naming things, and you want to be careful revealing your real name to someone, because that gives them power. And God wouldn't reveal, God's never revealed his name to us. Like, we refer to him as Hashem or Yahweh or, whatever. Yeah. So it's like, so yes. So for me, it's a yes, but. And I suppose, so like, I'll get you to comment on that, but I've got like a clarifying thing that I kind of like want to follow up on with that.
Yeah. So comment on that naming suicide increases the idea that it might
no. So commenting on this idea, like training is different. So if you're dealing with an individual who's having suicidal thoughts, that's different from giving an education program. They're two one different thing. There is a real danger with these with these things that they may actually be counterproductive.
With training people about training.
Well, so going into schools and saying, going into schools and saying, oh, hey, suicidal thoughts, blah, blah, blah. It's like, what suicidal thoughts? Oh, I haven't felt them. Why should I be feeling them? You know what I mean? Like, it's kind of like, so,
That's actually, I hear what you're saying. And yeah, there is that relationship between every time there's someone comes to a school and talks on suicide. Yeah. I mean, there is that. Yeah. I have heard that before as well, the increases of suicides. Yeah. I think that, but rather than do that, now we're talking about, resilience. So instead of talking about like the end, preventing against something, and certainly if we're trying not to go somewhere and we're focusing in that direction, we're going to see an increase of that, but we're focusing in the other direction of saying, well, let's increase resilience. Let's do talks on resilience. And so that's the way that we want to go to.
Which fundamentally is about.
So yeah, no, I see what you're saying. It's focusing more on what we want rather than what we don't want. Yeah, that makes sense.
See, so much government action is counterproductive. Like I've worked in the government a long time now, and I've got to be careful with what I say because like I've been chipped for this, and I've signed an agreement, where I cannot criticize. I can discuss issues, but I can't discuss I can't discuss policy, but I can indicate like, and I read this a lot, almost everything done by the government in some areas is actively counterproductive. It makes things worse. And it's the best intention stuff. It's like, and it's evidence. They're just making things worse. So it's like, there is that aspect to it. There's so much to it because, first you're calling something out, that's kind of related to category. And then you're like, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Sometimes, like if you have government taking over the role of people, you decrease resilience. You kind of like, because you, rather than the families and the individuals and the schools and the synagogues and the churches and everything else doing it, you got the government doing it. And like, they're kind of, I mean, God, they can't even build roads properly. Like, why would you, why would you let these people anywhere near your kids? You can't even keep the potholes out of the roads. Like, really? So look, I suppose I'll articulate this a little bit better. Look, I suspect part of the issue is categorical. So we'll get a little bit more specific. And let's think of this in the problem of category that Thomas Satz, I never pronounce his name correctly, but the Hungarian recognized when we have the DSM. Like the DSM is good. Again, it does what we've been talking about before. It calls things out, it names them, it categorizes them. And that, and we have a broad definition going even further up the hierarchical understanding of what a mental illness is. And from memory, it's something like a condition which causes disorder in a person's behavior or thinking that's clinically significant and impacts on their life. Words to that.
Yeah.
What's that? Have I got that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
definitely. That's 100%.
Okay. So, but the problem with that is all it really does really is describe behavior that we find unusual and abhorrent. And we're already well within the realm of subjectivity. Now, I totally accept and understand that there are bell curves of human behavior and consequently outliers. But let's pick something really, yeah, okay. Let's go there. Let's pick incest. I used to be in the juvenile aid bureau and like I dealt with some cases of that. Now it's nowhere near as rare
Okay.
as people think. It's still comparatively
Okay.
rare, but it's still a lot more prevalent than people perceive. It's not as rare as people think, but it's not like everywhere all the time. You know what I mean? It's still a very small minority, but a concerningly high minority. So
Yeah.
is this categorical framework that we've got so that, the DSM, everything we're talking about, is this just a way of avoiding categories of right and wrong, good and evil? Because we don't want to say now, and there are two distinctions there. So someone comes to you with like, oh, I want to be a better public speaker. Hey, no problem. There's no
Yeah.
moral value in that. But if someone comes to you with something
Yeah.
that's like they're destroying themselves or other person's lives. But I suppose there's a moral value behind suicide. Like the moral value behind suicide
Yeah.
that every human being's life is worthwhile and living, regardless of how much suffering you're going through. The world is a better place for you being here. And you're kind of like in some way you're sinning against reality to, objective reality when you reject that. That's a moral value. You know what I mean? So, how can you, I suppose is psychology just a way of avoiding those categories of right and wrong, good and evil? Psychs used to talk about that a lot.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. That's an interesting point, isn't it? So I'm not sure if it's about avoiding categories of good and evil. I think it's more about that person's subjective experience of that. And I guess, that's something in therapy that would say, well, there's no right or wrong to your experience, or and so that that helps to sort of work through therapy, sort of taking that away. I don't know, does that answer your question, or maybe I'm not
A little bit. Like, okay, let's make it specific. So someone comes in and says to you, like, I'm depressed, blah 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 blah. Oh, I'm drinking 10 beers a day. Oh no, I'm good with that.
Yeah, so we wouldn't go there straight away and confront them on that, but we'd look at other things and maybe like a well-being plan, and then gradually and gently in taking the path of least resistance, maybe they would try other things and then come back and decide
Yeah,
try to decrease
the
alcohol.
person's got to want to
A lot of
change.
the time,
Yeah.
that's and a lot of the time it's trauma as well. So if that person's drinking 10 beers a night, maybe they're doing it because they're feeling anxious and they're trying to mask trauma. So if we're working on the trauma, then the need to drink that many beers a night just automatically disappears.
Gotcha. Well, that actually links back because, like, we're now getting a lot of this trauma-informed education. So it's sweeping through the schools. So if you've got a child that's bad,
Yeah,
you've got to be trauma-informed. You've got to understand where that person is coming from. And
they
it's like,
don't know to be traumatized.
who can disagree with that conceptually? But in practice, you're quite often seeing it's like that's being abused. So you're getting two things going on with that. So first, the kid starts defining themselves as, oh, well, I've been traumatized, therefore I'm not responsible. And then the entire world has to change around this person to accommodate them, rather than them having to like change their behavior to fit in better with the world. Which again, so you've got something that no one would disagree with. It's like, do you want to be trauma informed? It's like, no, I don't want to be trauma informed. I hate being informed, and I'm not interested in trauma. Everyone can go to hell. It's like said no person ever. You know what I mean? So, but like really quickly, you've got this distortion of something that was sold as good and wonderful that almost immediately becomes counterproductive. And I'm sure, like,
Yeah.
I think that when that goes through schools, and well, it's in schools now, like, because I sit in the P&F meetings at, some of the, it's like, you're making things worse. It's like, yeah, I mean, we need to be empathetic. Yes, we need to understand where people are coming from. It's like, yeah, that's fundamentally part of the, again, the Judeo-Christian Western thing. But you don't indulge.
Yeah.
You can't indulge people.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, and I'm not sure how they manage sort of. I guess all schools have different policies on how they manage behaviors, but it's that whole there's fear-based discipline and there's a promotional-based discipline. And so fear-based discipline is about making the child do something because they're feeling afraid. If you don't do it, then you're going to get this punishment. And so focusing like more on that extrinsic reward, extrinsic punishment, whereas promotional-based discipline is about giving rewards for good behavior, ignoring bad behavior. And if we do see bad behavior, then getting to the underlying cause of that, which is a lot quicker way to resolve it. Say, okay, this child's like hit someone in the playground, well, why have they done that? Maybe they do, maybe something's going on for them at home. Maybe they need to go and get some therapy.
Yeah.
Maybe we need to increase the level of empathy that they're experiencing for their classmates. So yeah, I see what you mean. I think it's difficult, isn't it? Because raising a child, everyone does it in a different way. So everyone has like a different opinion. Then when you get to like a school, and they're sort of doing it a particular way and everyone's got to jump on board. But I think all schools do different things, and I don't know.
Yeah, no, again, it's just like, I don't know. I've just seen so many well-intentioned things that were sold like in really emotive ways go wrong.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I mean, you've picked up in this, I mean, you know me before this anyway, but like I'm really cynical. And ironically, that's actually not my default setting. Like I'm fundamentally, I'm a really optimistic person. Like I always have been, and it's still there. But I'm really, really cynical of like that sort of well-intentioned, kind of stuff. Because I think there's a lot of stuff going on with the people that are introducing that too. It's like, they're dealing with it. They're dealing with their own. What they want to do is they've got a certain worldview. And they want the world to to kind of like change. They want reality to change to suit their worldview. You know what I mean? And that they hammer in. It's like, oh, this is how human beings are. It's like, we can all just get together and I'll take all the money and split it up properly. I can do that. Like, I've got the understanding. But you think, well, but like we're talking about socialism, but fundamentally, that's the idea. It's like, yeah, I'm smart enough to be able to take all the wealth and distribute it. Because like, I know enough about each individual to be able to like kind of go behind that. And that's the equity argument too. It's like, oh, well, we need to change society to make it more equitable because no one starts off from, there is no level playing field. It's like, yes, true. Like, maybe you're too short, maybe you're too tall. Maybe you're mixed race. Maybe you're not as smart as you could be. Maybe you've been through some traumatic things. Maybe, all these kind of things. But this idea that someone or even a group of people can get together and technically identify what the causes are, treat them, and then get the right outcome. It's like, not only are you wrong, not only is that laughably proud and stupid, and it is, and I need to talk to people more about that. What also needs to happen is like, no, what you're doing is making things worse. Because I was really, I suppose the reason I focus on this a lot is, being in the police, we were basically a force for good. We really were. But I can think of, and like, although I failed and faltered and weakened and tired a lot in the police, don't get me wrong, I still think my career was, and I look back on it and I think hard about this all the time, a force for good. But I know there are things that I did catastrophically wrong. I'm quite certain there are some people who died as a result of decisions that I made that were wrong. And it's not like, it's like, hey, inshallah, it kind of
best at the time.
But what it does is it's given me a unique understanding, I think, about responsibility and authority. And it's like, you want to be careful about society or even individuals taking on too much authority and responsibility. Like the more diffused it is into the individual, the better it is. And I see like, that's the whole thing with So I understand that in the police, and I want to look at it in any authority. And like, you're a psychologist, so we'll make it. So we're talking about, making things better for people mentally. It's like, well,
Yeah.
are we? Is that actually what's happening?
Yeah.
Especially when you look at the evidence of all
Are you
these.
talking about like on a whole, like with psychology on a whole, or with what's happening with programs in schools?
I think it's part of it, because like you can't, like when you talk about psychology, I mean, you're talking about you're talking about a discipline, a group of people, a certain cultural understanding and stuff like that. Again, I do not think that I'm not a Scientologist. I think that psychology is a force for good in the world. And of course we need to understand, what drives and motivates human beings. But there is a massive capacity, like, because you think of the amount of authority that those people are taking.
That's a very good point. And we registered with APRA, and we really go through a lot of training, and a lot in our degree. You have to be a top student to be a psychologist, and because you go through several different degrees as you go through, so you've got to make it through to each one. But we've got very clear ethical boundaries, and you're right. There's this huge potential for harm as a psychologist. I mean, even to do with even something small. Like you'll have a client sitting in front of you. You've got a really great relationship with them, and you might say something offensive by accident one day, and that's caused harm to that client, and you might not even know, or there's so many different ways that we can cause harm, but there's that ethical boundary that we're always sort of following and checking in with, and going, okay, well, where am I sitting within that? So that's but that's a very good point.
But I mean, what's harm? Like sometimes you need to go back to the beginning of our conversation. Sometimes you need to slow someone down.
That's so true. Yeah.
What's harm?
I know. Oh, yeah.
It's like, again, we're all talking about, oh yeah, I know harm. I know harm when I see it. You know harm. I know harm.
Yeah.
No, we don't.
That's it. So the use of harm is so subjective, and I see that a lot. I see that a lot where people will they might go through therapy and it might not work, and then they'll say, well, conclude and say, well, that didn't work for me, or it's no good to to go to therapy. And so in a way, that's a level of harm, even though it's not intentional, and it might have still been sticking within the boundaries. But so no, I agree. There's always that potential for harm there.
We'll wrap it up.
Which we're always very careful. We're always careful about that. Yeah.
Of course. Well, we're coming to the last couple of questions, and they're a lot easier. I'm sorry to put you through hell, Zoe, but you did volunteer for this.
I've enjoyed it. No, it's been good. So it's a good banter. I like it.
Yeah. Look, for specific treatments, I'd actually like to go into a couple of specific treatments. Like, what are your thoughts on CBT? How effective and good is it? Coming to the last couple. And what is prophylactic therapy?
What?
Specific CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy.
Oh, CBT. Yeah.
So like,
and the other therapy, I've not heard of that therapy.
Yeah, prophylactic therapy. It's something that I heard just on a podcast recently. And I was like, I have no idea what that is. What is it wearing? Like,
wow,
I don't even know what that is. Okay. Well,
I've not heard of it. I've not seen any training coming up for it or anything yet.
Okay. Well, so we'll stick with CBT.
Yeah.
So how effective is it? How good is the literature? Yada yada.
Yeah. Okay. So cognitive behavioral therapy was developed of a combination from Aaron Beck and Albert Ellis, and it's a combination of cognitive therapy and rational emotive therapy. So it's the CBT is the theory that our thoughts, feelings, and behavior are linked.
Mm-hmm.
And that, do you have to go?
Yep. No, sorry.
Sorry.
I'm just
CBT is the. Oh yeah. Sorry. Thank you, because I'd like to hear what it is, and I doubt that I would be able to spell it if I went to look up myself.
Keep going.
So so CBT is the theory that our thoughts, feelings, and behavior are linked, and that by working on one of those things, we can change the other two things. So at a very strong scientific base, it's when we do there's different CBT, like changing our thoughts or challenging our thinking. But when we drill down to CBT, when we really drill down to it, It's very similar to psychotherapy, in that, what is the personal meaning of that for you? What does that say about you? And then challenging that or changing that thinking. So, for example, let's say that, if someone comes in and they're experiencing depression, and they might pick a particular situation, let's say that it's, they've tried out for a particular sport and they haven't gotten in, and that's sort of, let's just start with, one sort of aspect. And so we'll say, well, what does that say about you? Really like drill down to it. And it might say, well, it says I'm not good enough. And so it's about doing that manual reprocessing of saying, okay, well, what's the evidence that you are good enough? What's the evidence, that you're not good enough? And what do you want to replace it with? And doing it like that, the for and against evidence, and then replacing it. And CBT is so varied. There's so many different categories of therapy that fit into CBT. ACT therapy, so acceptance and commitment therapy, diffusing from our thoughts and feelings, rather than trying to change them. And there's behavioral activation therapy, which is a form of CBT, which is where we do actions that are going to really used for depression, that are going to increase our mood and our motivation. So working on that relationship between behavior and emotions. But yeah, CBT is a very, very effective form of therapy. Yeah, something that gives people something to sort of sink their teeth into, and do some work outside of sessions as well, and going away and carrying out that new behavior that's going to make that change.
Yeah, it's participatory. They've got something to participate in. Yeah, you get that sense of power. Look, thank you.
That's it, feeling engaged and participate.
Yeah. Look, thank you so much. I've really just loved this. Is there anything you want to add? So, is there, any other points you want to make? Anything like that? Like any words of wisdom for the good listeners of Northern Vibe before we?
No, just thank you so much for having me on the show, and I've really enjoyed coming on here today. It's been a really interesting conversation, and so I've really enjoyed that. A little bit like of a depth to it, and it's been really good. Thank you so much for having me.
No, obviously you're the
and
and if people want to contact you, where can they find? So if they've watched this and gone, hey, I think that lady would be an excellent therapist. Where can they find you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm at Shine Strong Psychology with Karen Dow, and all of our clinicians at Shine Strong are trained in EMDR. So we get a lot of trauma cases, but we also do a lot of work around depression, anxiety, relationships, not couples counseling as such, but more like individual based counseling. So a whole variety of things. So if there is anything that you have, decided to work on, please give us a call, and we would love to work with you.
Yeah, there she blows. Okay. Well, look, again, thank you so much for your time. I know you're busy as a one-legged ballerina. You were seeing people right up to the time of this interview. I don't take I don't take your time lightly. It is not unappreciated or unnoticed that you're taking time out of your phenomenally busy schedule to enlighten us with your unique perspective. Thank you so much. Yes, it was. And she was as busy as a one-legged ballerina. Please please share. If you got any guests that you want to hear or see, make sure that you inform me. Thank you very much. And I'll see you all.